The sun had barely set over Washington when the first reports hit the desks of intelligence officials. For months, the air had been thick with a specific kind of tension, a quiet, calculated dread shared by NATO leaders and defense experts. They had been bracing for a shift, a crack in the established rhythm of the war. Today, that crack finally appeared. It didn't take a massive military maneuver or a long, drawn-out diplomatic summit. In just a few hours, the entire geometry of the conflict shifted, forcing a complete rethink in the halls of power across Europe and the United States. President Vladimir Zelenskyy made an announcement that crossed a line the Biden administration had desperately hoped would remain untouched. The moment that boundary broke, CIA Director William Burns didn't hesitate. He bypassed the usual bureaucratic delays and sent a message to the Kremlin that was arguably the most blunt and direct communication between the two powers since the invasion began. For the last several months, the world had become accustomed to a certain version of Kyiv. Zelenskyy was the face of unwavering defiance, bold, strategic, and predictable in his demands. Whether he was addressing a foreign parliament or a crowd in a liberated town, the message was an ironclad brand. Ukraine fights, Ukraine pushes back, and Ukraine never surrenders an inch of its soil. But this week, that familiar pattern simply vanished. Those who spend their lives monitoring the pulse of global diplomacy notice the silence first. Scheduled meetings were quietly wiped from the calendar. Senior advisors, usually accessible, became ghosts. Private calls with European leaders were happening behind closed doors with no official readouts. When a wartime leader stops talking, it usually means the plan has changed. Behind the scenes, a new and uncomfortable question had entered the conversation. What does it actually take to end this? Not to freeze the front lines or pause the shelling, but to reach a finality. It was a question that would have been considered treasonous in Kyiv only months ago, but the weight of the war had become undeniable. The much-hyped counteroffensive had ground into a stalemate. Military aid from the West, once a torrential flow, was becoming a political tug-of-war in Washington. Most importantly, the human cost had reached a staggering peak. Even the most hawkish voices in Ukraine were beginning to look at the mounting casualties and ask how much longer the country could bleed at this rate. Then the shift became official through a series of unusual diplomatic signals picked up by Western intelligence early this morning. These were red-line communications, channels only used when a nation is signaling a monumental policy pivot. It became clear that Zelenskyy was no longer just fighting a war of attrition. He was fundamentally changing his opening hand for future negotiations. In a move that sent shockwaves through the analytical community, he indicated that Ukraine might be willing to discuss the future of Crimea. For a decade, Crimea has been the ultimate non-negotiable, the stolen peninsula that Ukraine vowed to reclaim at any cost. Now, through carefully worded diplomatic channels, the message was that Kyiv might be open to an arrangement that essentially shelved the Crimea question for future generations. In the cold language of geopolitics, this wasn't an official surrender of the territory, but it was a massive admission of reality. It was a signal that reclaiming Crimea was no longer a prerequisite for stopping the current slaughter. While some in the West viewed this as a pragmatic necessity, the CIA saw a different, much darker risk. The fear wasn't about the concession itself. It was about how Vladimir Putin would read the room. If Putin saw this as a white flag, he wouldn't reach for a pen to sign a peace deal. He would reach for more ammo. The concern was that Moscow would interpret this flexibility as a sign that Ukraine's will was finally snapping, inviting an even more aggressive push to break the country once and for all. Bamja, this is why William Burns' intervention was so critical. His warning to Moscow wasn't a routine diplomatic note. It was a high-stakes effort to manage Putin's expectations. Burns, a man who knows the Russian psyche better than almost anyone in the American government, made it clear that any attempt to exploit this diplomatic opening would be met with a massive, coordinated response. The message was designed to strip away any illusion the Kremlin might have that Western support was tied to Ukrainian rigidity. Even if Kyiv was willing to talk, Washington was still prepared to fight. Then as the day progressed, the American response moved beyond words. Intelligence assets across Eastern Europe were shifted to high alert. Satellite passes over Russian troop concentrations were doubled, and the Pentagon fast-tracked air defense systems to the front lines. The goal was to ensure that if Russia tried to launch a pressure campaign of missile strikes to force even more concessions, the cost to the Russian Air Force would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken spent the day on the phone with London, Paris, and Berlin, hammering home a single point: the alliance cannot show a single crack. If Putin detects even a hint of Ukraine fatigue in Europe right now, the chance for a stable peace vanishes. Zelenskyy is currently walking the most dangerous tightrope of his career. To his own people, he must appear as a leader who is exhausted by the bloodshed and willing to find a path home. To his allies, he must appear as a reasonable partner who isn't dragging the world into World War III out of pride. But to Putin, he must still look like a man with a gun in his hand. It is an almost impossible balance to strike. Some analysts believe this entire move is a strategic trap, that by offering a compromise he knows Putin will reject, Zelenskyy is proving to the world that Russia is the true obstacle to peace, thereby unlocking even more military aid. Kleino LLD. Tonight, the silence coming out of the Kremlin is deafening. Usually, Russian state media would be celebrating such a shift, but the official channels are curiously quiet. It suggests that Moscow was caught off guard by the speed of this development and is currently weighing its options. Putin is facing his own internal pressures: hardliners who want total victory and an economy that is slowly being choked by sanctions. He is a leader who views every concession as a weakness to be exploited, but he is now facing a United States that has proactively drawn a line in the sand before he could even make his move. Lambley, the next few days will determine the trajectory of the next few years. If the Kremlin chooses to escalate, the CIA's warning will be put to the test. If they choose to talk, we might be seeing the first real steps toward a ceasefire. But for now, the world waits. The diplomatic landscape has been permanently altered, and for the first time in a long time, the initiative doesn't belong to the generals on the battlefield, but to the strategists in the shadows.